on Monday, hundreds of Israelis gathered for a conference near the boundary with Gaza to promote the idea of sending Israeli settlers back into Gaza. And here's a video of Israel's national security minister, the ultra-far right leader Itamar Ben-Gvir, leading the crowd in song. It's short, I promise. And what it actually says, absolutely stirring. And what it says there on the podium is "Ne'arachim lehityashvut be'Gaza," which is we're preparing for settlement in Gaza. And Ben-Gvir told the crowd, "We are the owners of the land, and when we act like it, this is what brings results." He repeated his call for Gazans to, quote, voluntarily transfer to other countries because, quote, that land belongs to us. Now, this is not new. It's not even the first conference calling for the return of Israeli settlers to Gaza. There was a similar conference in January, but this time, is it different? In the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on October 21st, Rachel Fink writes, quote, "It might have been possible to dismiss the entire event as just the collective rantings of a fringe group of extremists with no actual power to affect policy, were it not for one thing, the lineup of speakers, because one by one, some of Israel's most prominent politicians made their way to the stage to express support for resettlement," end quote. And in its own editorial on October 21st, Haaretz states, quote, "The settlement movement's political ideas actually represent a sizable segment of Israeli society." And the newspaper adds, quote, "This is the time to wake up and understand that these dangerous ideas have already penetrated deeply into the ruling party. This is especially worrying because facts are becoming entrenched on the ground that perpetuate the army's presence and develop the infrastructure for civilian settlements, such as roads and army bases," end quote. What is adding to the concern is the emergence of something called the General's Plan to expel or exterminate the population of northern Gaza through starvation. And we talked about some of the effects of the deliberate starvation in northern Gaza earlier and last week. Palestinian human rights groups are raising the alarm about the plan. As our colleague Maureen Murphy wrote on October 20th, quote, "The Palestinian group said that Israel is implementing a plan spearheaded by Giora Eiland," that's the general in question, "a close advisor of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, aimed at exterminating or expelling Palestinians in northern Gaza. Eiland's scheme involves laying a full siege, denying the entry of humanitarian aid, forcing Palestinians to leave, and unlawfully declaring whoever remains to be a military target." Early in the genocide, Giora Eiland had advocated for Israel to allow or encourage epidemics among the Palestinian population in Gaza. People may remember him from that. And he thought that was a means to, quote, bring victory closer and reduce casualties among Israeli soldiers. So, and then we saw the emergence of polio, which is presumably something Giora Eiland would favor. Now, as Haaretz reported also on Monday, Israel is denying that it is implementing the Eiland plan. The newspaper says, quote, "In response to the international questions and criticism, official Israeli government sources made it clear that it has no intention of implementing Eiland's plan of transferring hundreds of thousands of people from northern Gaza to the south," end quote. But the newspaper says that even Western diplomats from countries supporting Israel do not believe this. Quote, "Contacts in the Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry told us that explicitly this isn't the plan, but it's hard to be convinced when you examine the military's actions on the ground," one diplomat said, according to Haaretz. And here is something even more alarming from the same article referring to Israel's operations in the north of Gaza. Quote, again, this is the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, quote, "Senior defense officials told Haaretz last week that the government was prioritizing the removal of people from northern Gaza in order to establish new settlements there instead of pressuring for a hostage deal with Hamas. Commanders on the ground said that they sensed that the operation's objective was to pressure the civilian population to move south in line with Giora Island's proposal. Senior defense officials believe that the government is neglecting the negotiations and advancing the creeping annexation of Gaza politically and as defense policy, end quote. Again, that's all from Haaretz. According to the human rights research group Forensic Architecture, Israel's new ground operation aimed at forcibly displacing the entire population of northern Gaza accelerates a pattern of genocidal violence since October 23. Reports from Jabalia, where the refugee camp has been besieged for 2 weeks, show intensified attacks on Palestinians. And I just want to add one thing. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the region, always a harbinger of bad things to come. And he reportedly asked Benjamin Netanyahu to repudiate the Giora Island plan and say that wasn't the goal. And reportedly, Netanyahu wouldn't do that. He just used some formula to fudge it. So that's a breaking event. So I guess my question, and one reason to bring this up is resettling Gaza Israel's real intention? Could it become a self-fulfilling prophecy where even if it is not the plan right now, if the genocide is not stopped and the population is expelled or exterminated, Israel might do it anyway? And remember, every American red line is a preview of what Israel will actually do, with ultimately full acquiescence. And finally, is it even possible, even now, when we see the fierceness of the resistance in Jabalia and other places, does this settlement plan presuppose conditions that Israel will never be able to achieve?
John, take a crack at that.
Yes, I think the resistance is too developed to do that. The Israelis were not able to secure their settlements in Gaza in 2005 after 3 or 4 years of the Intifada, with considerably less military experience, materiel, manufacturing, all of those things that we know now are so much more developed. I don't see under fire building houses in that area. I can see it being a Zionist dream. When they started fighting in Lebanon, the Jerusalem Post put up a story about how Lebanon was supposed to be their territory too, and that they could be building villas in Lebanon. I don't think, in military terms, that they say that the enemy has a vote, and in this case it's an Israeli plan, so the enemy is the Palestinians. And I think that the resistance is far too developed to allow that kind of project to continue. Israeli occupation within Gaza is one thing that is frightening, I think. Development, the way that they're operating in the corridors, in the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor, but the idea of building villas, there's a whole segment of Israeli population that was really upset about the 2005 disengagement. I covered that disengagement from Gaza and from the outside of Gaza, and the Israelis were really mad about having to leave those settlements and have always wanted to go back, and believed that if their settlements were there, that any of the wars that happened in between never would have happened. Cast lead and, pillars of defense and defensive, the 2014 war, the 2021 war, all of these times, and then especially October 7th, the argument by the Israeli settlers, the far right, was that if they had settlements in Gaza, that they would have somehow prevented those type of operations. I don't see it. I don't see the resistance allowing that kind of development to happen.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that this just seems like a desperate roll of the dice. Unleashing the settlers like this you know, it seems like a desperate roll of the dice for the politicians, for Netanyahu, and for the Israeli military. I mean, this just really relates, I think, to what Justin was saying about the signs of decay within the Israeli army, within the Israeli ground force, talking about this rash of recent articles like this disgusting CNN article. And this is actually what I'm writing about at the moment. And I've got a translation of one of the Hebrew articles that was circulating on, sections of it was circulating on Twitter this week. And there's a really telling quote from that, with one of the relatives of one of the soldiers who, as you know, is having all these terrible mental health problems to the extent that they're refusing to go back to fight again in Gaza because they're being fired at and fired on, and their colleagues are being killed by Palestinian fighters. And this is such a really telling quote from it. It says, quote, "The platoons are empty. Anyone who isn't dead and wasn't wounded was emotionally damaged. Very few remained who came back to fight, and they're not entirely intact either, mentally speaking, that is. That was before all the assassinations in Lebanon. And since then, he's been telling me," that is this soldier, the mother's son, "he's been telling me, I don't know what army they're planning to go into Lebanon with, but there is no army. I'm not going back to the battalion." So these are not like principled refuseniks. These are defeated soldiers, mentally defeated soldiers.
Yeah. And militarily defeated soldiers. I mean,
Yeah.
looking at the reports coming out from the front line in southern Lebanon at the border with occupied historic Palestine. I mean, just yesterday, right? There were a number of ambushes on soldiers, on Israeli soldiers, and there are videos now coming out of soldiers like literally running from the border back to their base. And
what do they call that? Breaking contact,
right?
But what it's also that there's no respite from it.
Yeah.
It's like you can be away from the front, but you know how often is 1 million, 2 million people in and around Tel Aviv having to run for the shelters
That's right.
because there are reports of a drone coming. Flights are being cancelled and rerouted, and so your ability to leave the country isn't even secure. And I think something that Justin Poda points out is that what's the point of any of this? Like, if all of this horror doesn't guarantee that you can live a quiet first world life in occupied Palestine as an Israeli settler, then what's the point? What's all this effort and loss for? And they can't live that quiet, normal first world life anymore as if they were in Montreal or Toronto or London or Pittsburgh. It's now you're on the front line, even if you're at a cafe in Tel Aviv.
And they can't even like bring their settlers back to those northern colonies. I mean, Kiryat Shimona is all but empty.
Or the Gaza envelope.
Yeah, or the Gaza envelope, exactly. And like John said last week, that that Israel has lost more territory than it has in decades. In just the last few months. I mean, it's kind of significant. So I mean, what should we be looking for? What should we be concerned about as these these kind of high profile, as the top of the Israeli political echelon, like Ben-Gvir continues
it's historically
to,
sorry, Nora.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, finish your point.
No. I was just going to say, like, as these leaders are continuing to kind of beat this drum of like, we're going to not only achieve all of our, so-called war objectives, which they haven't achieved any, but we're going to continue to resettle, to return the Israelis to the north while, expanding into Gaza and Lebanon. Like, what should we make of all of this?
I think it's like very highly historically significant what you were just outlining, Nora, that for the loss of territory. Israel has lost territory, in effect, lost territory. And, you know, I've been saying this for the last year. We've been saying it on this stream for the last year. The map changed on October 7th.
Yeah.
You know, it didn't just change for a day. It's in effect, you know, maybe they will send the settlers back. But so far, we're a year in, you know, apart from one or two people here and there, the settlers of the Israeli you know, kibbutzes, the settlements that besiege the Gaza Strip, they're depopulated.
Yeah.
They're completely depopulated, and there's not really much attention on this fact.
Right. And as Justin always says, you know, in order for Israel to execute these plans, they have to win the war first. So, you know, we shouldn't be giving these insane projects that are being planned by Ben-Gvir and these, you know, ultra far right extremist fanatics, you know, more credence than it's worth at this point.
But just a final thought on this. At the same time, they are still actually starving and murdering and exterminating the population of northern Gaza. So
of course.
that is happening.
Yeah. I mean, that's all that Israel knows how to do.
Yeah.
That's all they can actually achieve is genocide and mass extermination, trauma, suffering, and yeah, I mean, and so far, the West is not just letting them do it, but helping them do it materially. Fully committed. Yeah.
Kamala Harris is more committed to helping Israel exterminate Palestinian babies than she is to winning the election.
Absolutely.
And that's why she may lose.